Having a conversation with Mike Kurz. He's with the National Weather Service office in La Crosse. And Mike, obviously, a lot of things going on weather-wise over the last week here in the tri-state area. First things first, last summer, we're talking about drought and record drought. This year, we're talking about record wetness. How does the transition from a weather perspective happen so quickly?
Yeah, climate is one of those fascinating subjects. You think the weather changes from day to day so abruptly, but as we see these patterns we get in can change rather abruptly as well. So that makes it a challenge, not only from just a forecasting standpoint, but how do you deal with the long-standing drought that we were so used to for much of last year, going into such a wet pattern with its own impacts and really posing challenges for farmers who need to be in the fields and just flooding and things that we just weren't really used to a year ago. So yeah, the weather patterns and climate patterns can change abruptly, and things like that are something that climate scientists will be studying in the years ahead.
Is there any big picture conclusion that you can explain to us on why we are in the pattern that we are in right now?
We deal with the day-to-day weather impacts. So seasonal climate isn't really my
Okay.
specialty with that type of forecasting. But what I can tell you is it's not really going to change. It looks like over the next few weeks, we're just kind of in this continued busy pattern, active pattern, if you want to call it that, where we've got back to warmer than normal temperatures and these periodic bouts of rainfall that come through with seems like any disturbance that drops through the region, we end up with a lot of rain. Just kind of back in that, it seems unusual, but actually this is kind of more our norm, if you want to call it that, with last year was such an anomalously dry year that this just seems very wet, and certainly it is, but it's more typical that we have an active May and June in this part of the country here. So, rounds of thunderstorms, warm and humid conditions, that's actually pretty typical for our region.
And I'm asking this question is basing on my own perception. That's always a dangerous thing. But when we go from last year to this year, how do we know what normal is anymore?
Yeah, that's another thing with climate studies is that we look at a 30-year climate period, and that's how we determine what we call normal, if you want to refer to it as that. But it's pretty much just more or less an average of a 30-year period. So you look at the start of each new decade, you go back the previous 30 years, starting at that new decade, and that's kind of what you average with some additional data analysis to get our climate normal period. So right now we're looking at 1981 to 2010 as our, 1991 to 2020 as our climate normal period. So over that 30 years, and you can see as you compare these 30-year periods, kind of how things change. It's meant to reflect recent trends in climate. So, if you average over the entire period of record where you've got over 100 years of data, well, are you going to notice shifts in climate patterns over such a long period? If they won't show up quite as well. But so when you look at 30-year periods, you can see how the climate patterns may have shifted from one 30-year period going forward into the next 30-year period and so forth. It's easier for us to see kind of the more late developing climate patterns looking at 30-year periods.
And with the amount of rainfall the area received last week, I believe 4 to 6 inches in many spots around the area. I know many rivers are outside of their banks as of this time, but looking at it from a long-term perspective, and this is not counting any potential rain that could come as early as tonight, as we talked to you on Monday afternoon, the Mississippi River seems to be the main concern when it comes to flooding right now. How concerned are you from really up in the La Crosse area all the way kind of down to the Dubuque area?
Yeah, the water levels are rising. Of course, the smaller tributaries, they respond very quickly to these bouts of repeated heavy rainfall. So actually, a lot of the tributaries in Northeast Iowa, the Upper Iowa, the Turkey River, the Cedar River, and so forth, those have reached their crest and they're starting to fall now. But as that water drains into the main stem Mississippi, all that water is just starting to create these gradual rises on the Mississippi. And so there's some points that are already in minor flooding, and we've got other points that are forecast to reach into moderate flooding territory as well along the Mississippi River. So there will be, over the next week to 2 weeks, there will be definite higher values on the Mississippi, higher river levels, and some flooding to contend with as well. So folks need to exercise extra caution, and especially if they live nearby those water flooding river tributaries, to be on high alert as these waters continue to rise.
And you mentioned the smaller rivers, the Turkey, the Root River, the Upper Iowa River. They tend to react pretty quickly. They go up and go down pretty quickly. But the Mississippi River seemingly takes a while to go up and it stays there for a while. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a very large basin to hold all this water, whereas these smaller tributaries, they have much smaller inlets for all the water from the headwaters and basin drainage getting into those tributaries. So they respond. Small creeks, smaller rivers, they respond very quickly when we get a period of wetness, real heavy rainfall. But the Mississippi River, man, you're taking in all these tributaries in the area and all the way in points northward up to the tributaries, the headwaters, excuse me, up through northern Minnesota. So that water takes a long time to route down the entire channel and get into our area. So all the drainage from these faster moving tributaries, it takes its time to get into the Mississippi basin. And so we end up with these more gradual rises and falls versus some of these real sharp, up and down trends that we see on the smaller rivers.
I know some cities are across our area dealt with flash flooding with the amount of rainfall they dealt with in a very short amount of time over the weekend. Obviously, the flood warnings that you have issued for the Mississippi River seem some people have time to react at least to the rising river as of right now. What are some things folks need to keep in mind if they're residents or if they have property or they have loved ones near a river basin or a flood-prone area? What are some things folks need to know, knowing the fact that those rivers are going to be coming up this week?
Yeah, if you live near a smaller river or creek, those respond very quickly to heavy water. And so those are more prone to flash flooding when we get repeated rounds of heavy rainfall. So you especially want to be on high alert if you live along or near one of those types of tributaries, and be ready to seek shelter and higher ground if needed. Certainly be ready to respond. For folks that live along near the Mississippi, where the water levels rise much more slowly, you have a little extra time. But of course, the impacts are more likely to come. There's usually higher uncertainty with how high the water is going to crest on these smaller, fast responding rivers, whereas there's greater certainty that we deal with in the Mississippi just because it rises and falls so gradually. So we have a very high confidence in certain points reaching flood levels through this week into next along the Mississippi, and just take your normal precautions. And watching the forecast is especially important. You can go to weather.gov to get the river forecast information for where you live so you can be ready and know how to respond properly.
And of course, the weather tonight, seeing the threat of some severe weather, hail, damaging winds, a few tornadoes, as if we haven't dealt with enough here in the last week or two. When it comes specifically to rainfall, how could that affect area rivers and streams and creeks and the Mississippi River itself?
Yeah, so with this round that we're looking at coming in tonight, there's high confidence that we'll have a developing thunderstorm complex somewhere in the region. The sticking point is exactly where is that going to develop and then track. So that's going to have all the bearing on who gets the heavy rainfall out of this batch of storms, and potentially any severe weather, severe winds, and the other hazards, like you mentioned, hail and possibly a tornado. But it looks like wind and heavy rain will be the main threats with this round. So we're still determining exactly where we expect these storms to develop. the good news for Northeast Iowa is it looks like the greatest bulk of activity is more likely to occur further north and east. But that's not to say Northeast Iowa is entirely out of play. There's certainly the storms could build further south and west, and so it's a possibility. We're watching to see where those develop, where the heavy rain is most likely. Some points in the heaviest rain areas could see another possibly 2-3 inches out of this round. So we'll have to see exactly where the storms track, but just being aware of and monitoring the forecast, especially for any potential watches that might get issued, because this is going to be an after dark severe storm possibility tonight. So we want folks to be aware, have ways to receive warnings that can wake you up if necessary tonight, and just be aware of what's going on, ready to respond.
And I imagine with most of the area pretty saturated right now, any 2 to 3 inch rainfall, there's just nowhere for that water to go, right?
Pretty much, yeah. The ground is very near saturated. So it looks like the bulk of the heavy rain is going to be kind of more impacting parts of southeast Minnesota and Wisconsin. So that's where we have another flood watch in effect right now. We'll be monitoring to see how the trends progress into this evening if we need to expand that flood watch further south into northeast Iowa. But definitely everyone should just be ready and aware of the weather situation tonight.
All right, Mike, appreciate the time as always. And hopefully we won't have to talk to you too much this week, but I know you're always at the ready to inform the public because that's what you guys do very well. Thanks for the time this afternoon.
You bet. Thank you.
Mike Kurz with the National Weather Service office in La Crosse.